What's up, y'all? It's your boy AB. Welcome to Dig This. I am thrilled and delighted to introduce my guest this week, Luke Eplin, the author of Moses and the Doctor, Two Men, One Championship, and the Birth of Modern Basketball. Luke is also the author of Our Team, the epic story of four men and the World Series that changed baseball, about the 1948 Cleveland Indians. And his latest, Moses and the Doctor, tackles the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers, the last 76ers team to win a title, as well as the dual stories of two ABA legends, Julius Dr. J. Irving and Moses Malone. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Dig in. Can you talk a little bit about how Julius Irving really has a legend that surrounds him?
Yeah, he really does. I think that Bob Costas had talked about how Julius Irving is the last legendary sports figure, or at least among the sort of major sports that we think about, because he's the last one whose feats, at least in the beginning of his career, largely went untelevised. The ABA did not have a national television contract. So you did not get to see Julius Irving highlights the way that you would then get to see, say, Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant highlights. I had a lot of writers tell me who covered Julius Irving in the ABA that if you did not see Julius in the ABA, you actually didn't see Dr. J. That's whenever he was youngest. That's whenever he was at his most improvisational. That's whenever he was at his most athletic. And the way that the ABA played, he was also at his most sort of fearless. That was sort of fit in with the style of the ABA. So the unfortunate thing about that, though, is that you didn't get to sort of see what he was doing. You could only hear about it. Julius Irving, or I would say Dr. J, was formed by oral mythology, by people seeing him or saying that they saw him, and then talking about these feats that he was doing, each one growing taller by their own telling. And so Julius Irving became a larger than life figure, largely because very few people had actually witnessed him. It reminded me of like Satchel Paige in my first book when he was in the Negro Leagues, where most of what Satchel Paige did were things that people then just talked about among themselves. So that by the time Satchel Paige finally made it to the major leagues at the age of 42, there were people literally ripping out the turnstiles to see him. They had just wanted to see if the myth measured up to the man. And to Satchel Paige's great credit, even at age 42, it did. And so with Dr. J, whenever the leagues merged, the ABA merges with the NBA in 1976, it was the first time that Julius Irving was really going to be seen. And so there was this kind of mania that developed so that people could actually see if this Dr. J figure was as wild and interesting and creative as they had heard.
And also that he was, by being an ambassador for the ABA, and there were other great stars in the ABA, of course, which we'll get to, but by being held up as this ambassador, and immediately in his first year in the NBA was on a title, was in the finals, he sort of represented this idea, or at least as it was portrayed in some parts of the media, as the schoolyard game versus the professional NBA game, which had all sorts of racial overtones to it as well.
Julius Irving had the misfortune of, whenever the NBA and the ABA merged, he had an agent who had signed a 7-year contract for Julius Irving with the Nets. There was this idea that halfway through the contract, the deal was going to be sweetened. Julius would get some sort of, unspecified bonus. Whenever the NBA-ABA merger happened, the clubs that joined the NBA had to pay tons of fees, and they did not get television rights until a couple of years into their tenure. And so a lot of these clubs are really struggling to stay solvent. There was no way that the owner of the Nets could pay Julius Irving, so he held out, and which eventually sort of necessitated his trade to the 76ers. The 76ers at that time had gobs and gobs of talent. They had George McGinnis, Doug Collins, Daryl Dawkins, World Be Free, all of these kind of
Jelly Bean Bryant.
Yeah, that's right. Jelly Bean Bryant, Kobe Bryant's dad. And they kind of didn't need Julius Irving. And so by joining this team, it almost created a negative perception in certain fans and certain sports writers' minds that this was a team of mercenaries, this was a team of sort of wild playground figures. And let's face it, this became the ABA team. They had three different stars from the ABA: Caldwell Jones, George McGinnis, Julius Erving. Those were three different starters. And so they kind of took on all of the baggage that came from the ABA and all of the racial overtones that came into the ABA. The ABA was thought to be playing a more black style of play with this sort of playground notion that formed around that style of play. And so whenever Julius Erving makes it to the finals in 1977, he's playing the Portland Trailblazers, led by Bill Walton and their coach Jack Ramsey. And the Blazers kind of stood in for the stodgy, the sort of like traditionalist NBA, and let's face it, white. And so it became a very racialized finals, and certain people looked at it almost in apocalyptic terms that if the Sixers beat the Blazers, that was it. The sort of playground was going to rule, and there would be anarchy on the court from then on. So whenever the Sixers did kind of fold, winning the first two games and losing the next four, it was like they breathed a sigh of relief. The ABA had been defeated. The NBA was still on top.
Yeah, and at the same time, Julius Erving, who always seemed to avail himself to the media, and always seems to be very well liked by the media, even if he wasn't particularly candid, seemed to speak very plainly about that narrative during the time.
Erving is a very interesting figure in his sort of off-court life. I mean, on the court, he's Dr. J. He's this wild, fearless figure. He's creative, he's liberal, he's spontaneous. Off the court, he's Julius Erving, and Julius Erving was cautious, careful, eloquent, well-stated. Somebody told me that he was the sort of person who was envisioning his words in print as he spoke them. And so it is actually interesting in that Dr. J, I'm Julius Erving, spoke all the time, and he was always available for quotes, yet he actually didn't say very much. He spoke more in the sort of cliches and sort of flowery language that you sort of think about with athletes. But whenever he did feel slighted, or whenever he did feel that a narrative was forming around him that he didn't like, he could cut to the heart of it. And that's what he did here. He really did not appreciate the fact that his style of play was being denigrated as lesser than the NBA. He didn't. He was very sensitive to the racial overtones of that finals, and he didn't see the Sixers as being any sort of villains. And so he was very outspoken about that, to his credit.
Yeah, one of the things I love about this book, Luke, is that it's a corrective to a lot of things. And one of the things that it seems that you really stress in the book is, perhaps for those who aren't familiar with the ABA, maybe there's a popular thought of it as it was expressed in Semi-Pro, the Will Ferrell movie, that it was just kind of a bunch of clowns. And it wasn't. There was a serious brand, even if it was an upper minor league / was it as good as the quality of the NBA? Probably not. But the fact that it seems that it was like a point of emphasis for you to talk about just how great that league was and how formative it was to what the modern NBA became.
Yeah, one of the things that I really hit upon while researching this book was that the 76ers, by having so many different stars from the ABA, they first had George McGinnis and Julius Erving. They later got Bobby Jones. They later got Moses Malone, of course. And so they were the stand-in for the ABA all the way up until Julius Erving wins the title in 1983. And there was this sort of perception, as you said, that whenever the ABA and the NBA merged, people like Red Auerbach, the president of the Boston Celtics, and many others thought that the ABA was a circus league. They looked at that red, white, and blue ball. They looked at the wild style of play, and they were just like, this is not a serious thing. These guys come to the NBA and they're going to get buried. And so because the Sixers kept making it to the finals and losing, or losing in these very heartbreaking ways before the finals, that narrative kept just taking hold. So by the time that like Julius Erving finally wins in 1983, he doesn't win just for himself and Moses, two people that were really trying and failing to win. He wins for the ABA. I looked at that 1983 finals against the Lakers. The Lakers had zero people who had played in the ABA. Not a single minute was played in the ABA from that roster. Whereas you look at the Sixers and they had numerous people that have played in the ABA. And so it really was the last time that the ABA faced the NBA. And finally, after all those years, the ABA won. And so that's why I thought that the 83 finals, which, was kind of anticlimactic, the Sixers swept, but it actually isn't. It's the culmination of all of those years that Julius Erving is carrying that baggage into that finals.
Yeah, and we obviously looked at Julius Erving as the face of the ABA, but he was not the first guy who played above the rim. What
Yeah.
was it that sort of distinguished Irving as Dr. J, as this new kind of level of aerialist?
Julius Erving, one of the things that I learned about him early on was that even in the 1970s, the early 1970s, when he comes into the ABA, he's talking of himself not only as a player, but as an artist. He's using that word. He's talking about the way he plays as artistry. And so he's thinking about what he's doing in aesthetic terms. And he himself even says that he realizes there are ways of playing basketball that are more aesthetically pleasing than others. And so he wants to not only win and sort of play the game the right way, but he wants it to be beautiful in the same way that like a figure skater or a ballerina or any of these things are beautiful. And in order to do that, Irving, even as a young man, as a sort of teenager and whatnot, was practicing these moves that are beautiful. The ones where you start on one side of the basket, end on the other, these dunks, these sorts of twisting, contorting plays that really get an audience excited. And he does it over and over and over every day, practicing that the way that you would practice free throws. And so that by the time he actually starts doing these in games, they are not seen as wild circus shots that coaches at that time would pull you out of and say, hey, take that back to the playground. They're seen as an extension of who he is and how he plays. So you can no more pull Julius Erving from the game for doing that as you could pull Julius Erving from taking a half court shot. Like it's who he is. And he makes that a fundamentally sound part of the game. The way that I would say it is he professionalized the playground more than any other player before him. And that really sets the blueprint for all of these players that come after him, whether it's Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant.
Do you think that there was anything, I mean, it just was his own natural personality, but he wasn't a whirling dervish on the court. He was very controlled. After all, his name is the doctor. There is something surgical about it. Can you talk a little bit about that coolness that he had?
Yeah, I do think that, like, I mean, I just said earlier that there are sort of separate identities for Julius Erving, where there's Julius Erving off the court and Dr. J on it, and they seem to be in opposition to one another. But that's actually a little bit too simple. Erving himself is a very careful, considered individual. And so, yes, he had that ability to improvise, but he always talked about how he visualizes moves in his mind. He even dreams about moves, and then he sort of unleashes them on the court. And so you very rarely see sort of clips of Irving where he's doing a move and it just airballs and it looks like he's completely out of control. He's always kind of in control the way that a surgeon might be in control.
Yeah.
And he's sort of slicing to the basket and making just the right cut and just the right sort of like incision to get him into the right place. And so you see these sort of great highlights of him, and they almost look like he'd done it 1,000 times and, was just kind of, almost, again, like he's shooting a free throw. They don't seem like he's, I don't
Exerting.
know. Yeah, exactly. He very even rarely seems to sweat. He just kind of seems like he's always just kind of the coolest dude out there, just doing these things that other players could never dream of. But for him, they're just as easy as shooting a layup.
Yeah. And enables him beyond just the competition of being a sports, of being a sports, beyond just being a sportsman, there's this artistry on it. But to your point about sweaty is the right word, let's think about Moses Malone and Moses's story, which is a different kind of artistry than practiced by Julius Erving, and also a story that perhaps Isn't well, no, we're talking about maybe Dr. J's story being buried a little bit. Well, Moses
Yeah.
Malone won 3 MVPs the last I checked and
Hmm.
was a terror in the league. Was What was it about Moses that made you want to make this book a sort of dual biography?
Yeah, that came later. Like I said, I started with Dr. J. The way that I approach books is through character. I really thought that Irving was going to be the engine for this one. But then whenever I started thinking about the ABA and Irving's struggle to make it to the top, I started thinking about how Moses was not only sort of the polar opposite of him on the court, as you said. Moses is sweaty. Moses sweats all the time. And Moses always said that if he looked at himself playing and he wasn't sweating, he'd get mad because then he wasn't doing what he wanted. But off the court as well, Julius Erving was available for everybody. He signed every autograph. He was available for beat writers. Moses was not. Moses was kind of closed off. He was very private. He was introverted. And I started to think of these two individuals as perfectly opposite in so many different ways, so that by the time they finally come together, because there's not all that overlap between them, they snap together in place in a way that like two superstars very rarely do. Like Julius Erving was the MVP in 81. Moses Malone was the MVP in 82. You take two MVPs together, you're going to get a lot of ego problems. You're going to get a lot of sort of like struggles between who's the man here. But you really didn't get that with those two because they were doing something not only so different on the court, they just had some sort of ideological and philosophical differences that prevented them from ever really having that friction that you might between two stars, even between, say, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, who always seemed to be a little bit at odds with each other. So yeah, I really was thinking about sort of opposites and the sort of different ways of being in that era, and how that can sort of complement each other if you put it just right.
And could you talk a little bit about Moses's, you talk about Julius Erving you won 3 MVPs in the ABA. Was it a couple of titles? How many titles did he win in the ABA? Two,
Two, yeah.
right? And so he's, the face of the league for all intents and purposes. But Moses has his own sort of level of notoriety in the league too. He just wasn't just another guy.
Yeah, Moses Malone was most notable in the ABA for one thing, and that was he was the first high school player ever to jump directly from high school to the pros. At that time, the NBA had this gentleman's agreement where they would not select a player in the draft who had not fulfilled 4 years of college eligibility. And so that kind of allowed the college system to stay in place. The ABA, who was a little bit more fighting for talent, a little bit more of a shoestring league, realized that if they were going to compete with the NBA, they would have to go where the NBA wouldn't. And so they instituted what is known as a hardship clause. Basically, any player that could show hardship could be drafted before the college eligibility expired. Anybody could meet that barrier. They just kind of, it was nebulous, so it allowed them to get these undergraduates. And it kind of got to the point where Moses Malone, I mean, you have to imagine Moses Malone in high school was like LeBron James was. He was a chosen one. He was a prodigy. Everybody recognized how special this person was. Hundreds of colleges came after him. He was hounded day and night by recruiters. And for somebody like Malone, who was rather shut off and had a very small circle of friends, it was torture. He hated it. But he got drafted by a franchise in Utah, and they really went after him, even though Moses Malone had already signed on to the University of Maryland. And he did jump directly from high school to the pros. And it was a tremendous scandal at that time. A lot of people said that this was robbing him of his education, that it was a terrible precedent to set, the whole 9 yards. But Moses did not struggle. He was ready to go to the pros, and he got right off the bat running.
And that move actually had a ripple effect in the NBA, didn't it?
Yeah, because then the NBA sort of recognized that if the ABA was going to get the choicest young talent, then they were going to get the big stars. And so the NBA not only got rid of their 4-year rule, they started going after high schoolers. The next year they signed Daryl Dawkins, and Daryl Dawkins, Chocolate Thunder, the guy who broke a lot of backboards. Oh, nice. There he is. Yeah, he became right after Moses Malone. And very interestingly, Moses Malone and Daryl Dawkins had very parallel lives that would collide with each other because Moses took Daryl's place on the Sixers after Daryl did not live up to his potential.
That's right. And then, of course, after Dawkins and Bill Willoughby in 1975,
Mm,
no, 74, 75,
six. Yeah, yeah.
then there was not another high school kid to jump until Kevin Garnett did it in 95.
Moses Malone has this really fascinating career where he starts off in 75 as the first, prep to pro player. That year, the NBA Finals was played basically in a barn. It's this giant, sort of cavernous, sort of high schooly sort of stadium. He retires 20 years later in 1994, whenever there's, giant uh, arenas with jumbotrons. And so he kind of rides out that entire wave. The very next year after Malone retires, Kevin Garnett gets chosen out of high school. And so he bridges that entire divide. And then it's picked up as soon as he retires, almost as in a symbolic way, where then you have, Kobe comes out, Tracy McGrady comes out, all of these people come out. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, Moses kind of was the ancestor of that, even if he's not, he's just not remembered at all, hardly.
And he was the last ABA player to retire from the NBA, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. I mean, he started in the ABA when he was 18. So yeah, he was younger than most people. But yeah, he lasts all the way into the 90s.
And could you talk a little bit about, I mean, one of the reasons I think perhaps Moses is not better remembered now is because the modern game is spread out and it's so much different that somebody who is getting a ton of offensive rebounds, those rebounds are going to be Camerooning off in a different way today. So it's even hard to imagine an offensive rebounding machine in the same way. But could you talk about what Moses did during that era and how he fared against the other great centers of the time?
Yeah, he's not someone like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar who has this beautiful sky hook or something like that, or Akeem Olajuwon who has these amazing sort of spin moves. He's doing everything through, and we're going to have to venture into cliches here, just like grit and hustle and just kind of pulling and tugging and using his butt to get rebounds. If Julius Erving talked about himself as an artist, Moses Malone constantly talked about himself as a laborer. He talked about himself as a factory worker. In the very few interviews that Moses does, he's really using blue collar imagery to talk about himself. He even hated the idea that you played basketball. He always said he worked basketball. That's just what he did. And so he's down in the paint, just kind of banging it out with these guys, doing every trick he can to get rebounds. And because of that, people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who, is not the most rugged player, hated playing against Moses Malone because Malone would just grab his jersey, just get up on him, everything he could. And so Malone kind of is dominating these guys, even though he's much shorter than them. I think that he was kind of like I talked to one guy who described him as a jackhammer. He just kept going and going and going and going. He didn't have an off switch. Daryl Dawkins described Moses Malone as an octopus. It seemed like he had 8 hands and they were all reaching out for the ball. And so it was just this sort of constant presence where maybe in the first quarter you can control him. But by the fourth quarter, when you were tired, Moses wasn't. He was still jackhammering and he would just wear you down.
Interesting. Which brings me to thinking about that the way he perceived himself as a
Yeah.
real blue collar kind of a guy, and then him coming to Philadelphia,
Yeah.
which is a town that really venerates that kind of mentality. And yet Moses he's a lunch pail guy who's getting paid top shelf. I mean, he wasn't ever Moses handled his business, it seemed, exceedingly well. He was always when he got signed by the Sixers, he was the highest paid player in the sport. Am I correct?
Yeah. 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 By far.
And so just to sort of dial back a little bit, sort of like, first of all, I would like to know how Philadelphia embraced um, both Moses Malone and Julius Erving, but in general, to talk about the sporting climate of Philadelphia in the early 1980s, as well as a backdrop of socio-political climate in that being the Frank Rizzo years when he was the mayor of Philly.
Yeah, so in the 1970s, Philadelphia, like a lot of other industrial towns, was undergoing a sort of deindustrialization that was hollowing out the downtown. A lot of people left. There was what you would call white flight, and a lot of the people that stayed were either African Americans or white ethnic individuals. And there was this tremendous racial tension that was coursing through the city that was then exacerbated by the election of Frank Rizzo in 1972. Rizzo was a mayor who came to power under this sort of quote unquote law and order platform. He was, let's say, somebody who was very unsubtle in his racial talk. And so a lot of African Americans at that time felt targeted by him. And it just led to all of these sort of problems in the city. Julius Erving was very interesting in that his big word that he would always use was crossover. You can see it all the time in interviews. He wanted to cross over not only from the Black neighborhoods where he was kind of an icon because of the Dr. J-ness, but into those white ethnic enclaves that were voting for Frank Rizzo and that sort of looked askance at Black athletes of the time. He wanted to make them feel safe. And so he presented this very sort of benign visage to them so that there was a sort of crossover effect. Unfortunately, what that could end up doing is flattening your own personality. There were things that Julius Erving, for all of his eloquence, just simply couldn't say. And when you did ask him about sort of racial matters, he would either talk about sort of bridging, bringing together, crossing over, things like that. But he was reluctant to really get into the specifics of what was happening in Philadelphia. Moses Malone, on the other hand, had this sort of blue collar working ethic that he had, and even his large salary. He talked about his salary in terms that a blue collar worker would, understand. He said that he earned that salary, that salary came solely through hard work, and that he was going to make sure that he never slacked off because he knew he was getting paid. So he still kind of was like a punching the clock kind of guy. But at that time, usually these sorts of quote unquote blue collar workers, these people that were sort of getting by on effort, were white superstars. They were the sort of ones that didn't have the quote unquote natural talent that an African American would. That, you sort of look at the sort of leaping ability of Dr. J and you think, well, that's just came through his sort of natural athletic ability, when all those hours that he put in were sort of whisked away with phrases like that. Moses Malone was one of the sort of rare African American athletes who could become a white working class hero simply by being who he was. He had an authenticity that came off of him that you really couldn't teach or fake or anything like that. And so Philadelphia embraced him in a way that I think they didn't even embrace Dr. J. Dr. J was having a very hard time drawing fans to Philadelphia at that time. But as soon as Moses Malone comes in, it's like the whole city, which was divided so heavily along racial lines, could agree on one thing: Moses Malone is one of us.
Huh. That's so interesting because, as you said, when we think about it, the Sixers were already a force. I mean, they were a formidable team. They had been in the finals in 77. They had played the Lakers twice, 80 and 82, before Moses got there. So it wasn't as if they were, struggling during those years. But at the same time, the Phillies had won a World Series in 1980. The Eagles had gone to a Super Bowl. What was the relationship between Philadelphia as a city overall, like with the Sixers, compared to even the Flyers, which I know always had a pretty strong fan base?
One of the things that you have to really put into context here is that when the 76ers came together in 1976, 1977 with Julius Erving, George McGinnis, all of this talent, there was this idea that they were just going to run the table, that they had so much talent that they couldn't lose. Even the coach was like, am I even allowed to lose a game? And so when they do lose to the Portland Trailblazers in the final, Philadelphia is angry. They were like, that title should have been ours. You blew it. And so the 76ers, capitalizing on that anger, do this very ill-conceived advertising campaign that says, we owe you one. And so it was this sort of debt that the Sixers owed to the city, where they should have won that championship, and now they have to repay it by winning one. And I knew about that line before, but I did not realize how racially charged that line was. Like, it really, because of Philadelphia being such the sort of symbolically African American team at that time, it really was this sort of idea that these black players owed white Philadelphia a title because that so many of their season ticket holder base would have been white fans at that time.
Hmm.
And so it just kind of hung over them. And each year that goes by, 78, 79, et cetera, that they don't win the championship. And they're often losing in heartbreaking fashion.
Yeah.
The 76ers fans became disillusioned. And by the time that 82 comes around, they're even angry. They're just like ready to just give up on the Sixers. And so it's a strange thing where Julius Erving is selling out arenas across the country, Cleveland, Buffalo, all of these places where you don't expect to sell out. But in Philadelphia, they're drawing fewer than 10,000 people because there's this sort of apathy and disgust that has settled in.
How much did Irving have left in the tank for those years in the NBA?
He comes into the league in 76, 77, and all those years of being on asphalt where he's playing on the playground really start to catch up with his knees. You can sort of look at even pictures of Dr. J during his first year in the NBA. He's wearing these giant knee braces, which cannot be good for mobility at all. And so I talked to a lot of authors that had seen him in the ABA, and they told me that you're in, that move in the 1980 finals where he goes up
Yeah, the
from
Grover Washington.
basket. Yeah, it goes over and all that. It's iconic. It's played pretty much every time the NBA finals is coming on. Um, these writers told me that he did that every night in the ABA. Maybe not that specific move, but something along those lines. Whereas in the NBA, it comes out only in bursts. And I think that's sort of underlined by the fact that after that game where everyone is just like, "Oh my God, did you see that?" Julius Erving is just like, "That was just a layup." Like that was just like to him, it was just kind of a nothing. He'd done that his entire life, but by that time, he wasn't able to do that sort of as consistently and frequently as he had in the ABA. And so, yeah, really, Dr. J, he tries to revive him in the NBA. There's sort of a section of my book where I talk about how in 1980, when Julius Erving turns 30, he really makes this conscious decision to discard Dr. J. Dr. J becomes baggage. So he shaves his afro. He starts dressing in more conservative three-piece suits. He opens up a shoe store. Like he's doing these things to sort of signal to his fans that I'm Julius Erving now. I'm a mature person. I'm going to be more of like a business sort of thing. And so really,
In a way, setting a template for entrepreneurial, regardless of how successful he was or not at it, he was already sort of setting a template of an athlete's thinking about life past his playing days and not thinking about, oh, I'm going to be a coach or I'm going to be a GM, but past the sport in a way.
oh yeah, and you look at people like Magic Johnson, who talk. Magic Johnson, a great entrepreneur now, who owns lots of movie chains and all that, really talked about how he studied Julius Erving, and that's what he was doing. And you look at someone like Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan didn't have to fight for the way he was playing because Julius Erving had already shown that you can play that way and be an effective player. And Julius Erving had shown, or had opened up markets where black athletes could, advertise to majority white customers in a way that like allowed Michael Jordan to just seamlessly step into that. And so, yeah, he really is the blueprint, even if both of those players then eventually eclipse him.
That's right. It's like the comparison between Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy. Richard
Right.
Pryor, toiled for a lot of years, and by the early '80s was the first African American to be the #1 box office star in the country. He totally different personality, but Eddie Murphy stepped into something as a young person, having hit movies, and didn't have to sort of face the same slings and arrows, so to speak.
Exactly.
Luke, I am interested in what you found out about how the Sixers were covered locally in Philadelphia during the '80s, because Philadelphia, I almost feel like the Sixers, is a little bit overlooked sometimes as a great sports writing town. Starting from when Larry Merchant was the editor of the sports department of the Philly Daily News in the late '50s and the early '60s. George Casita, for many years, was a legendary basketball writer from Philly. And you mentioned by name a few times George Shirk, who
Mhm.
was writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer and was a longtime basketball writer. Was there anything in particular that you gleaned from the way the team was covered?
Yeah, they had incredible sports writers. I would add to that list Phil Jasner, who wrote for the Philadelphia Daily News, and Stan Hochman, who had a great column for I believe the Inquirer. I might be wrong on that. So they had several people covering the team. I would say that, like, first of all, Philly the Sixers are kind of the third team in Philadelphia. Like the Eagles are one, the Phillies are two, and then come the Sixers. But because they were so good, you got such great long features on that team. And
Mm.
you know, I think it's tough. I didn't include this quote in the book. Mike Schmidt, who was playing on the Phillies at the exact time that this was happening, said that in Philadelphia is the only town where you can where it's something like you can win a game for your team and then get just pummeled for it afterwards in the paper. I think that there was a sort of harshness that came with this at the time, and so by the time that the Sixers are losing in the 80s and whatnot, the writers are very tough on them, and it's the negativity spirals into that into those sections. But for the most part, I mean, gosh, this is such a different era, man. It's like there were maybe 30 people total working for the Sixers at the time. They all flew commercial. There was just the writers had tremendous access to all of these people. They were writing not only what they heard from Julius Erving, but what they observed. There's so many great scenes that I was able to get from
Mhm.
these sorts of reporters at the time. I mean, the access that you would have that they had back then now would have just been unthinkable. I'll tell you the one thing where I knew I had a book was in 1982. Julius Erving loses the finals to the Los Angeles Lakers. It's his third loss in 6 years. He's 32. It looks like that's it. That's the end. There's no more to it. Everybody's getting old. There's this sort of apathy that's set in. And Julius Erving, who is, as you said, the coolest man on the court, starts crying. And the writers really are able to see that and to sort of like talk about it in a way that I think nobody would have gotten that out nowadays. And that's whenever I was like, wait a minute, why is Julius Erving crying? What's that? And that was the chapter that I based my proposal on. And it all came from this tremendous, access that writers had. And then I knew, of course, to ask all the players, like, what do you remember about Julius Erving crying? Because it seems such a tremendously important sort of thing. And yeah, nowadays, I mean, does LeBron James cry? Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, he does, but he wouldn't certainly do it within eye shot. And
Hmm.
who could blame him? Because any image that is projected out there can quickly be manipulated and put into a
Yeah,
meme. And 20 minutes later, you could be whatever, the crying Jordan face. I mean, these things beyond one's control would prevent anyone from being candid ever, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Um, can you, Luke, can you talk a little bit about I'm a little bit older than you. I do remember the Sixers in those years, in particular the 83 team.
Yeah.
I was a short kid, so tended towards guys like Tiny Archibald, who was from New York but played for the Celtics as a guard, and Maurice Cheeks, who was a point guard for the Sixers, but in particular Andrew Toney, who
Oh,
was
yeah.
their shooting guard. And didn't have a long career, but was a really charismatic player. Can you talk about some of the, other than the magistry of Julius Erving and Moses Malone, some of the other players from that championship team that sort of were super interesting for you?
It's funny because there's always a situation like this where you have such transcendent players like Irving and Malone, yet if I would say the vast majority of Sixers fans that I talked to, their favorite player was Andrew Toney. Andrew Toney was just this guy that I guess we would say now had no conscience. Like he could go 0 for 12 and still want to get the ball. Like
It was like
he
Lloyd Free. I mean, it
oh
was
yeah,
like that kind of a player.
absolutely. And everybody that played against him, if I'd asked like what was Maurice Cheeks like, a lot of opponents that I talked to had a couple of things to say, but Andrew Toney, everybody had a story because I think that they worried about him, they fretted about him. Larry Bird said that he was the best player he played until Michael Jordan came in the league. he was really something. But he's a black box now. He got injured at the end of his career. I think the Sixers botched the injury. He held on to that resentment and just retired into solitude in Georgia and will not entertain any interview offers. He hasn't been interviewed in decades.
Huh.
So he was impossible to get to. So you did have to kind of write around him. They also had such
Why were
interest
people worried about him? Why were people worried about him even back then?
worried about him as in like
Well, you had mentioned, you said like other players liked him. They all had a story about him, and they were worried about him. Or was that like sort of later?
no, they were worried about him just because like they knew that it's kind of like that Dr. J is going to get his 25 points. You know that Moses Malone is going to get his 15 rebounds. Andrew Toney was the question mark. He could get 40 points
Oh, I see what you
or
mean.
he
Yeah,
could
yeah.
get 5 points.
Right,
And
right.
so he was kind of like a stick of dynamite that you had to make sure the fuse never got lit. And so I think that there was this idea of him. I think Julius Erving called him the X factor, where if he heated up, which he did against, say, the Celtics in the playoffs, the Celtics just weren't going to win those games because Tony could shoot you in or out of a game
Right.
almost at will. And that was the sort of thing that drove head coach Billy Cunningham crazy, is that he was uncontrollable, sometimes in the best ways and sometimes in the worst ways.
Yeah.
And it was kind of balanced by Maurice Cheeks, who was this point guard from Texas or North Texas, who really was the steadiest force on the court. He was very unselfish. Billy Cunningham always had to try to get him to shoot more because he was always looking for the other man. He was just kind of like a metronome, day in, day out, just ready for it. He didn't want any publicity. He rarely called attention to himself. And that kind of complemented another player, Bobby Jones, who was probably at his time the best defensive player in the league. I didn't put this in the book, but I talked to Cedric Maxwell, who was a forward on the Celtics. And he said that Larry Bird always had this thing where he would get insulted if you put a white guy on him. He was just thought that was, he was going to torch that white guy. The exception was Bobby Jones. They could put Bobby Jones on Larry Bird and he would not feel insulted by that because he was that good of a defender. But Bobby Jones, too, did not really care how many points he got, did not really care for the spotlight. He was there to rebound. He was there to take charges. He was there to play defense. And so they had all these great role players that could really, aid the superstars, very unlike the 76-77 team where everybody wanted the ball. By the time the 83 team comes around, they knew where the ball was going. It might go to Julius Erving, it might go to Andrew Toney. And then they had all these other people that were sort of there to back them up and do what it took to win.
And was there, I mean, obviously there was huge celebration, but was there just a sense for Irving winning that title, even for Malone, because it was the only title that either of them won, of great relief as opposed to just exaltation?
It's really interesting because Irving, by the time the 1982 season comes around, a narrative starts to form about Dr. J where he's transcendent player, great guy, doesn't quite have what it takes. And I think that narrative grated against him like anything else. I mean, if you wanted to get Dr. J mad, you could sort of talk about like why can't your teams win? And he would always just be like, we win all the time. We just haven't won the championship. And so by the time the 83 finals comes around, and it's very clear that the Sixers, even before it starts, are probably going to win, Julius Erving, for once in his life, is not cooperating with the narrative that sports writers have pre-written. He is not saying, I'm finally there where I can win it. He's saying, I won twice in the ABA. I have the most wins of anybody since I've come into the league. I just haven't won the championship. And sometimes that's just out of my hands. And so that by the time that they win and the sports writers are trying to get him to be like, finally, and say something very eloquent about how long of a road, but it's been worth it, he won't do it. And he's still kind of surly in the locker room with them, where he doesn't like that narrative, and he's panicked that that's going to be his legacy. So I think that he's relieved not only to have won the championship, but he's relieved that will not be his legacy. And if you look at any books that have been written about him, or even the book that he wrote, he's reluctant to engage in that sort of like period.
reductivism, that
Yeah,
great American sort of narrowing of of it's either you win or or you're a
yeah.
loser, like
He's reluctant to sort of delve into the sorts of emotions that he might have felt in 1982 when he's crying. It's like those were the emotions of somebody whose legacy was now set, but he gets a miraculous second chance because the Sixers signed Moses.
yeah. And obviously he would have been in good company, Charles
Sure.
Barkley, Patrick Ewing. We could just talk about any number of Ted Williams, Ernie Banks, Brent, great players who never won a title in their respective sports. Luke, before I let you go, I just wanted to ask about, well, let's face it, the most famous quote from either men, which belongs ironically to Moses Malone. At the end of the 83 season, Malone had actually been injured, so there was some concern about how he was going to play in the playoffs. He was getting himself ready, and George Shirk in the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that when Billy Cunningham asked him how he thought they would do, he said 4-4-4, indicating that they would sweep all 3 rounds at that point, which is what they would have to play in the playoffs. It
Yeah.
was subsequently known as fo,
Mhm.
FO, not 4-4-4 as was originally published, which
Right.
brings to mind if you had known Malone, most people would have probably said fo, because that's the way he would have actually have said it. However, the racial overtones of tweaking that language is something that is hard to ignore. And I never knew that the original quote was 4-4-4.
I think it's one of the reasons why Moses Malone was so tight-lipped. That he had this very rapid fire way of speaking that was tinged with a Southern accent, and for people that were unused to that, style that he had, they claimed not to understand what he was saying, or they would sort of type it out as he spoke it, which is racially problematic on many different levels. And Moses Malone, for all of his silence and whatnot, he was a perceptive individual, and he kind of retreated into his shell because of that. He did not trust white sports writers overall to be able to tell his story or render his dialect in a way that would be respectful of it. And so going into this book, I was very concerned about Moses Malone, both because I wasn't sure I liked him, because I didn't know very much about him, and I sort of knew I thought he was a very surly character. And two, I was like, he's no longer with us. I wasn't going to be able to talk to him, and he never talked. And so I was like, how can I make this person three-dimensional? But what I learned was that that's not the truth at all. That Moses Malone talked when he wanted to, and whenever he did talk, he was A, very funny. He had a lot of great quips. He was very quick. And B, he often said exactly what was on his mind. He just said it in a very sort of like forceful, curtailed manner. And so you look at Moses Malone in the 1981 finals, he said that he and 4 guys from his hometown of Petersburg could beat the Boston Celtics on their own. There was just this very sort of like incredible confidence and very sort of straightforward way of talking, which leads to the faux quote, which, as you said, Moses Malone was injured. There was no idea whenever he said that quote how healed he was going to be for the playoffs. The Sixers had just gone off a stretch where they went 8-7, so it wasn't like they were just rampaging anymore. They themselves had suffered through a lot of hardships at the end of the season. And for Moses Malone to predict that they were going to sweep it must have seemed ridiculous. And also, if you'd asked Julius Irving, what did you think? What do you think the playoffs is going to happen? He would have spoken in paragraphs about, well, it's going to be difficult. We're a little injured. We're this and that and that. And it would have been nothing memorable. And it would have just been sort of standard stuff. For the central irony is that on a team with perhaps the most eloquent and just, accessible sports star that perhaps we've ever seen, it was Moses Malone who gave them the sort of literary flourish that cemented the team in history. And I think it's only fitting that it would also have racial overtones to it because the Sixers had been dealing with, this idea of being the ABA team, the sort of black team, the way that played, the playground style of basketball ever since Julius Erving entered the NBA. And so I think
And they even
it's
embraced it on the championship rings, right? What was it?
yeah, full five full.
Which
Yeah.
because they won, he was one off.
He was one off. Yeah, they lost a game in the second round to the Milwaukee Bucks. And so it's both ironic and fitting at the same time that line came from who it came from and had those racial overtones that it did.
It encapsulates, what makes this book so intriguing. Again, I told this to you in an email. And I mean this is the highest compliment, Luke, but I feel that your prose style and the way you guide us through this story had this sort of briskness and tact and intelligence that Maurice Cheeks used to have when he was running the point. The book
man.
just, for me, it was reminiscing on some parts of my childhood that I knew, but there was so much of the story that I didn't know, and it just moved along so briskly that, you don't have to be an NBA fan to really find this a really compelling story. And just wanted to thank you again for taking some time today, coming through and chatting a little bit more about it. This has been great.
Thanks, Alex. I had a great time. Thanks.
Thanks again so much to Luke Epplin for joining us this week. You must check out Moses and the Doctor, as well as Our Team, his first book about the 1948 Cleveland Indians. Thanks again to the man in the blue bathrobe for providing the beats, and John Partham for making sure everything sounds better than bad. It's your boy AB. Thanks again so much for joining us.